My name is Alica Kizeková, and I'm the program coordinator for the 12th International Symposium on the Czech Foreign Policy, Building Sustainable Connections, event that was supposed to take place in Prague at Černín Palace. Everybody was looking forward to experience the discussions in person, but also experience the city, some after many years. Regardless, today we are connecting from 3 countries. So I'm in Australia, in Queensland. Then we have Professor Nancy Snow, who is in Japan. And then we have also Dr. Françoise Nicolas, who is in Paris, in France. So we have quite a mixture of countries and time zones. I have mentioned this in my opening remarks, but for those who have not heard it before, this is the first time we've got a female expert part in our symposium, and in as early as opening expert remarks in the 12 years of history. So I think it's wonderful to have this experienced female experts speaking today on topics that are so prominent, sharing their expertise. Respectively, we'll start with Professor Nancy Snow, who is at the Kyoto University of Foreign Studies, but she's also emeritus professor at the California State University in the United States. She'll be the first one to speak. And her topic, as far as I understand, will look into the governance practices at the time of pandemic. Nancy will have 10 minutes, and then I'll introduce our second keynote remarks from Françoise. So Nancy, please, if you could share your observations with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I'm delighted to be here and to make a little history with you all today. I just want to say that I'm so sorry that we cannot be together in Prague. Prague is one of my favorite cities. I share that with a lot of other people. It's the city of 100 spires, and I have many fond memories of walking the Charles Bridge, among other bridges, and visiting the old Jewish cemetery, taking in the Shadow Theater, and even drinking Pilsner. And I'm a non-beer drinker, so that's saying something. The inspiration for my brief remarks today, Where Do We Go From Here, is a nod to Martin Luther King's last book with that title. And the subtitle was Chaos or Community. He was really asking a question, reflecting back on the civil rights movement. King said at that time, shortly before his assassination, that regardless of ideology or party membership, the United States must unite in a social movement order to create equality of opportunity and to erase poverty and the fissures that exist across classes and races. It's an extraordinary read that I would highly recommend. My remarks, as somebody who's really been living public diplomacy and propaganda for 25 years now, is that we are in these times, in this pandemic, we are more reliant than ever on government communication and foreign policy explanation. Never have we been more dependent on our very lives, on public officials, including public healthcare agencies that we've come to know through their initials, their acronyms, the CDC, WHO, local, state, and national authorities who oversee our very movement as human beings. This obviously means more potential for not only information distribution, but also channels of manipulation that run interference in that process. What I'm seeing today, and I'm sure I'm not alone in our gathering, is a global information space that is marked by a constant fight for our short-term span attention. As a consequence, we find ourselves living now in a global information war environment. And this environment offers an overabundance of information. We are awash in information, which soft power guru Joseph Nye would describe as a paradox of plenty that leads to a scarcity of attention. And when we cannot take in all of this information, and at the same time that we have these short attention spans, we are giving, with this scarcity of attention, an asymmetric advantage to those actors on the international scene who exist in the Czech Republic, who exist in the US, who exist in Japan, who exist in China, and so on, who attempt then to alter or destroy what we know as objective truth. We may have to accept that objective truth is becoming futile. In its place is the audience-determined credibility and trust factors. So who do you trust is a subjective question. Who do you believe is also a subjective question. But what are the facts follow from both of those questions? And writer David Brooks wrote a piece in the New York Times that I wanted to quote from. This was published on March 12th, 2020, one day after the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a global pandemic. He said, quote, that if history is of any guide, unlike natural disasters such as hurricanes and earthquakes, pandemics generally drive people apart rather than bring them together. Containing a global pandemic requires unprecedented international cooperation, which is elusive at best at the moment. Every nation is fending for itself in combating the spread of the virus. My question to us today is, are we getting better at cooperation, or are we where our mentality was, our reality was on March 12th? We are certainly awash in plenty of combative narratives, as reported by Columbia Journalism Review. At the end of January 2020, an email chain circulated in the Czech Republic that claimed COVID-19 had been registered with the United States Patent Office as early as 2003. Another email went around in February suggesting that it was a targeted pandemic created by the Americans to sell a profitable vaccine. China itself promoted the idea that COVID-19 was actually an American disease first spread by U.S. Army officials and soldiers while visiting Wuhan, China in October 2019. Not to be outdone, we've seen the U.S. Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, and certainly President Trump and others in the Trump administration very pointedly refer to the Wuhan virus or the China virus early on. The only time that Trump hesitated from using that term was when he was felled within the last week by this thing, this invisible thing that he thought would just go away soon. I'm very discouraged, really, as an educator, that we are going to be able to educate ourselves out of this global information war environment. We place a lot of emphasis on education and education for good things, for democracy and democratic participation, get out the vote initiatives like we've seen in mass in the United States, where we're breaking all records in early voting, human rights, racial equality. But we must remember that education is not necessarily the best protection against the worst propaganda. Intellectuals and the so-called educated are the most vulnerable to propaganda campaigns. Why? Because A, we tend to absorb the most information, including secondhand information, hearsay, rumors, and unverifiable information. B, we are compelled to have an opinion on matters of the day, and we thus expose ourselves more to others' opinions and propaganda campaigns. And C, we consider ourselves above the influence of propaganda, thereby making ourselves even more susceptible to propaganda. What I see today in the landscape, and I want to try to bring this to a close, is that we are increasingly about choosing and then defending sides, not finding things in common. Our commercial media systems, I would indict feverishly because they feed these wars for ratings and profit. Heat is preferred over light. And modern forms of communication, including mass media, social media platforms, are becoming biased political instruments of propaganda. Not all the time, certainly. They have some good uses, but they are in addition to the good uses being used as propaganda channels. I think I'll make one more point here. Imagine if we could go back just 6 to 8 months ago and the world's leading economies, the G7 or even the G2, the top two, the US and China, if they elected for the sake of the planet and its people to forsake national interests for global common good, could we have seen that? Could we have nurtured something alternative? I think there's still hope that we can turn this around somewhat, but so far we are still stuck in the old realpolitik of promoting the nation state and national interests as sacrosanct. And finally, one must become aware of propaganda, its limitations, its strengths, its influence, and its persuasive qualities, if one is to master it. To say that you are free of the influence of propaganda is a sure sign of its pervasive existence in our society. And I see it really as the converse of the best types of democratic systems that we can have. So I'm going to close with that and allow the other speaker now. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Professor Nancy Snow. I think you touched on some very important points that I think pre-exist in some ways, the COVID, you know, maybe the COVID situation exacerbated some trends, and that's something I will be exploring in our discussion, because the points that I would like to look into is what you mentioned, whether the cooperation between states is getting better. We need some solutions quickly, and governments are actually tackling the crisis on their own. And then they need to collaborate. It's changing so fast. And also, like you mentioned, the cases of propaganda from leaders, but also through the social media. So thank you for that. I will switch now to Director of Ifri Center for Asian Studies, Françoise Nicolas, to deal with another important topic of economic deglobalization taking place. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Alica, and thank you to the organizers for organizing this very interesting meeting. Of course, it is a real pity that we are not in Prague. I'm a beer drinker, so I do regret not to be in Prague to drink Pilsner, which is my favorite. But too bad. Well, we'll try to make the best of this second best possibility or option. And indeed, I'm going to talk about economics, which may not be the most exciting topic, but I hope to make you understand that this time it is quite exciting to discuss economic issues at this time of pandemic. So the whole question is really to know whether this COVID-19 associated crisis, let's call it like this, because there is a health crisis to begin with, and then the response to the health crisis has actually created an economic crisis. So I'd rather call it a COVID-19 associated economic crisis or led economic crisis. But anyway, so the whole issue is to figure out whether this crisis will be a real game changer in the global economy. Well, and on this point, I have a relatively nuanced position, as you will understand pretty quickly, I hope. Well, this COVID crisis will not leave the world economy unscathed. That's quite obvious. This crisis is the deepest downturn since the Great Depression. So it's really a bad period for the global economy, for the world economy. So we can necessarily, we will have major impacts and we will see major impacts. One issue, though, is to figure out whether this will lead to some form of deglobalization. And this is something that we hear pretty often, that we read in the press. We are heading towards deglobalization. And my talk will really be concentrating on this issue. Well, the first point I want to make, and on this one, I guess I concur with something that Alica said in her concluding remarks after Nancy's speech. I think that this crisis actually acted as a catalyst. So it has amplified, it has accelerated pre-existing trends. So it's really worth stressing that this crisis did not take place in a very quiet, smooth, perfect, ideal environment. And as far as the economy is concerned, there were already pre-existing trends which suggested that there were doubts, there were concerns about globalization. There were basically, what we can observe are basically two major trends which predate the COVID-19 crisis and which may have an impact on the form or the shape of the global economy after the crisis. The first of these trends was the result of rising tensions between the big two, the G2, as Nancy called them, that is China and the US. I mean, this is quite obvious to everybody. There have been rising tensions over the past few years between these two big powers, and these tensions led to calls, or at least some form of pressures, for decoupling. And decoupling is, of course, some form of deglobalization. At least it's a pressure towards less globalization. So this is the first pre-existing trend, and I will argue that the COVID-19 crisis simply amplified or exacerbated this trend. The second trend that was already also observable before the crisis is precisely the rising doubts about the benefits of globalization. There were more and more analysts claiming that first, globalization may have gone too far. We were entering, or we were already in a world of hyper-globalization, and this was really deemed to be excessive. So there were, at the time, disillusionment about globalization. Globalization was thought by some to be more, or to have been more detrimental than beneficial. So there were already doubts or discussions about the validity of this globalization. So the COVID-19 crisis simply amplified this trend. And let me explain or elaborate a little bit on that. So to a large extent, there is nothing really new. What we have is a clarification of the debate on hyperglobalization and the value or the costs of this hyperglobalization. So let me explain. Well, the crisis really has laid bare the weaknesses, some weaknesses of globalization. And in particular, it has highlighted the vulnerabilities of the global value chains. These global value chains are major markers of globalization and even of hyperglobalization. These global value chains are the result of vertical segmentation or fragmentation of production on a global scale. So we have geographical dispersion of production units depending or according to countries' comparative advantages. A company will decide to slice up its production process, and each step of this production process may be located in different places according to the respective comparative advantages of these places. So this is what we have in mind when we talk about these global value chains. And in a period of hyperglobalization, we have very finely sliced up or fragmented production processes. And what the COVID crisis showed is that this very highly fragmented production processes are extremely risky, and they may be vulnerable to a change in one single part of this long chain. And the problem in this specific case was that the problem started out or broke out in China. And China is at the heart of these various very long and complex global value chains. Well, to be very concrete, as a result of the lockdown in China, the logistic chain and the supply chains were interrupted. And as a result, production and shipping of intermediate goods, of parts and components ground to a halt in China. Since China is supplying most of the other economies in the world, producers in the rest of the world could also had to stop their production, or at least to first reduce this production, and then at the end of the day, they had to also stop. So what happens in China has huge repercussions on the rest of the value chain and on the rest of the world economy. So this is something that became extremely obvious with this COVID-19 crisis. Of course, we had already observed such things in other cases as a result, most of the time, of natural disasters. But the problem in this case is that it was not really a natural disaster, it was something else. And to a large extent, this crisis was, well, man-made. I'm not saying that the virus was, a Chinese virus was, built by anybody. What I have in mind is that it is the response to the crisis that actually, to the health crisis, that actually led to economic problems. This is where I argue that it is man-made. But anyway, so what this COVID crisis has shown is really the fragility, vulnerability of the global value chains and all the risks associated with a highly fragmented production. And of course, the longer, the more complex the value chain or the supply chain, the bigger the chance of disruption. So what the COVID-19 crisis has taught us is that due to this vulnerability, we got the calculation wrong in the past. In the past, what we observed was that the priority was given to economic considerations. The reason for putting in place this long and complex value chains, the reason was purely economic reason. The reason why the companies decided to act this way was that they wanted to cut costs. So cost efficiency was the priority at the expense of security. And of course, security considerations may be more prominent in the minds of governments, but not necessarily in the minds of companies. And here in this crisis, the companies realized that, well, actually security is part of the cost calculation, and they got it wrong before. So we really have a change of mindset that is required in this case. Well, China, as I said, being a real big part of the problem in this COVID-19 crisis, it helped solve the cost issue on the one hand, but it has also raised security issues. And so at the end of this COVID-19 crisis, what we see, or in the wake of this crisis, what we see is a change in the priorities or rearrangement in the priorities. And I would argue that the COVID-19 crisis has really led to prioritize resilience and dependability in production over cost savings and efficiency through global outsourcing. So this is a major change in mindset, I would argue. So this tension that we had before between the governments that were more concerned about security and companies that were more concerned about costs, this has really changed in the wake of the crisis. So are we then heading towards some kind of a deglobalization, or is it the end of hyperglobalization? Well, I don't think so, not necessarily. There will be some solutions or some actions taken to mitigate the problems raised by this COVID-19 crisis. There will be reshoring. There will be shortening of the global value chains or simplification of these global value chains. There will be diversification of suppliers. So there will be most probably a number of technical responses to the problems that are now more apparent with these global value chains. But this will not necessarily lead to full deglobalization, simply a rearrangement of these chains. However, I think that what can be expected in the future is less globalization and perhaps, hopefully, a more reasonable globalization. So I think that in response to this crisis, there are two things. First, there is more space for the government. There is more space for, in particular, industrial policy. So I think that we may see at the end of this episode a return of industrial policy, more interference, more intervention by state. And the second thing is that I think that with this crisis, we will see the end of what I would call liberal market fundamentalism. So just pushing cost efficiency considerations over any other considerations, I think this is the end of it. But I may be too optimistic, and I will leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You took us to a different world. I feel like we're having two parallel topics here, but at the end of the day, it actually all is so linked, because what Nancy was talking about with governments utilizing certain positions in their arguments, often they respond to the economic trends and the supply chains, the business cycles. So I think both of your topics are related. If I may, I have questions for both of you to think about. We have not yet received comments from the audience, so I just need to invite the audience. If you're interested, there is a slido.com linked, and the event code is #SYMPO Simpo 2020-11. So if you would like to leave a comment to our speakers, this is the good time. We have time for discussion. From my side, and apparently we have 160 people watching us, so that's a good number. I would like to ask both of you, and I'll share my questions so you can think about it, to Nancy. Obviously, you mentioned a very important point, which is the issue with working together, governments working together, and the propaganda from the government. And you also mentioned the US government. I cannot omit, not because you are American, but discussions about the current elections coming up in the United States. I just watched today the vice presidential debate with Mike Pence and Kamala Harris. And from her side, I felt like she was saying, we have abandoned our allies, those we collaborated and had our backs. And that's something we should focus on. She was suggesting for the future, we need to look into those reliable partnerships. And she was actually saying that from their side, the US was not as safe as it could have been previously. And I think, obviously, Mike Pence's position, we all know what the current government's position is in the US. So whether you see their possibility for some change of approach, depending obviously on the electoral results. But we need to look into the future and how these governments can work better together. What do you think will be the primary messaging after the elections? Do you see any topics that might come up, even from your view, something that you already are noticing or that could pop up, not just the COVID crisis, but we really have to start looking into some prominent topics for next year. For Françoise, you mentioned China and the security, obviously, that goes hand in hand these days. What I'm actually interested in is China has created a network of connectivity projects through the Belt and Road Initiative, and we will have a panel on Eurasia, but this is important to mention it already here. How you view feasibility of some of these projects, because obviously the chains might have been disrupted, the timeframes might have not been as efficient as was promised, the investments. We might be actually questioning whether they are able to deliver some of the bold proposals. Do you see any reassessment from the Chinese government in this particular side of their policy? Because it's become a vision, but we all know there are some specific engagements in place. And I personally don't see how that would just end now. But do you notice any changes in approaches? Might be too soon to assess, but maybe you do. So I will give you a word to Nancy and Françoise, and then we'll start to look at the questions from the audience.
You know, I did not see the vice presidential debate, but I don't think that it really matters, because what you're mentioning here with restoring the image of the United States, not just the image, that sounds a little superficial, but rather the morale of, say, the Department of State, the equivalent of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in many countries. This has been an enduring concern since Trump was elected in 2016, because he made it very clear that the U.S. was going to go it alone, and so be it. We are that strong as a country that we can do that. And we're really showing our Achilles heel now, and this is a rescue operation. I have no doubt that Biden-Harris will win triumphantly on November 3rd or thereafter, but make no mistake about it, the sort of shadow government of the Trump administration will endure. I could see Trump having his own TV network. He came out of TV. That's where he really got his fame. And he will continue to tweet and be a social media influencer, and will continue on this refrain that there is no better, more wonderful country in the world than the United States. So we have quite a, when I say we, as a country, as a community, we have a lot of catching up now to do, because we've become a bit of a laughing stock in the eyes of the world, when the eyes of the world were really looking at the U.S., not always to lead, but to have a seat at the table. It was really noteworthy last year during the G20, where Japan was hosting in Osaka, and I was struck at the image of the arrival of Trump with Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner in tow. And it was almost as if the U.S. were the host and not the Japanese and not Shinzo Abe. And we had become used to that image of somebody who walks into a room and just takes over the room and sucks up all the oxygen in the room. So it's ironic that the global pandemic has really unveiled the idiocy of that reality, that everything that we are enduring now we will not be able to overcome without international cooperation. We're going to have to really renew our lease on international cooperation, and this will take all of us, and not just the cult of personalities that we've been living under so far.
Thank you. If I may invite Françoise.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, one first thing on China, and then this is something I forgot perhaps to elaborate on during my talk, because I cut it short, is the fact that China was part of this crisis is extremely important, because the perception that we have in the West, at least, is that there is a possibility that China may weaponize or instrumentalize the interdependency that is prevailing. And this is why it makes this COVID crisis now, this COVID-19 crisis particularly, dangerous, or it is perceived as extremely risky for us, because there is this possibility of weaponization of independency by China, which is at the very heart of the whole system. But to go back to your question about the Belt and Road Initiative and how will it be affected by the crisis, if at all. Well, again, if you look at the situation before the crisis, what you see is that the BRI project was not necessarily in very good shape. If you look at figures, simply at figures, what you have seen is a constant drop in investments as part of this Belt and Road Initiative ever since 2017. So we had a huge rise in investments in the context of this big project, and after a couple of years, it started to drop. So there was already some kind of there were a number of issues apparently with this project for a number of reasons. You have the so-called debt trap. Whether you believe in this debt trap or not, is it a deliberate policy on the part of China or not? What is for sure is that a number of countries are indebted, and excessively indebted. It's not necessarily always the case. The blame should not necessarily be put on China. In the case of Sri Lanka, for instance, Sri Lanka is highly indebted, and it had to hand over a couple of assets to China, but it's not exclusively indebted towards China. It was indebted even before. So debt trap, I don't really buy this story, but what is for sure is that there are a number of issues with the projects that China is trying to push. And what we have seen also is reluctance or resistance in a number of countries. Reluctance or resistance on the terms that were imposed by China, or resistance about the scale of the projects that were pushed by China. So, the Belt and Road Initiative was not really doing that well, even before the COVID-19 crisis. However, I don't think that it will go away. This Belt and Road Initiative is Xi Jinping's brainchild. It is his pet project, so he won't drop it. This big initiative is actually part of the constitution, the Chinese constitution today. So there is no way that it will be fully abandoned. But what I think will happen is that, and it is already kind of happening, it will change, the nature of the project will change. So Belt and Road Initiative will still be there. We will still hear about BRI, but it will not be exclusively about infrastructure, about hard infrastructure. It will be, I guess, more about digital, the digital Silk Road, and it will be more and more about soft power. It will be about standards. It will be about this kind of influence, but not hard infrastructure, as was at the very beginning, as was the case at the very beginning. One last word about the possible change that we already observe. Well, we've heard a lot about BRI over the past few years. What I think is that we're going to hear a lot about dual circulation or double circulation in the years to come. This is the new motto launched by Xi Jinping, double circulation. So what is this all about? We don't know exactly. As usual in China, they launch a big slogan, and the content of the slogan is clarified eventually. So we don't know exactly what it means. What we understand is that China does not intend to disconnect from the global economy. So it will still be integrated in the global economy, that the international circulation, but it will promote the other form of circulation, which is internal circulation. And internal circulation is about two things. It's about making the domestic market more autonomous, more dynamic, and it is also, so it is a little bit of self-sufficiency, and it is also about pushing domestic technology. So making China less dependent on outside technology. So this is very much in line with the Made in China 2025 program that had been launched a couple of years ago. So this is a little bit the continuation of earlier programs, except that now it is presented as a comprehensive project by China with this dual circulation. The risk on our part is that if there is too much emphasis being placed on internal circulation, if China then becomes more and more autonomous, almost self-sufficient, it can easily cut the link with the rest of the world economy and, well, put an end to the international circulation. This will not be totally impossible. So we have to keep an eye on this, but I guess we will hear more and more about this double circulation thing in the next years to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Françoise. I want you to add, and I want you to answer a question, please, because audience is asking you a question. So please just let me tell you the question, and then you can have your, we have last 3 minutes, so you can have your space. The question was, Dr. Snow suggested education may not be the best way against propaganda. Now $1 million question, what is it then? So you can add and maybe tackle this question as well, please.
Yeah, by that I meant, and it was really inspired by Jacques Ellul's book, Propaganda, which I've read thoroughly, and you need a lifetime to really fully understand it. But I think that we look for these kind of easy outs. And what I'm suggesting, I'm an educator, so I'm all about education. But part of our education should include critical thinking, should include courses in propaganda studies, courses in understanding manipulation, countering disinformation, because that's here to stay. Whether or not we get changes in office through elections, it's mind-boggling to me, all this emphasis in the United States about get out the vote, but very little of that info space has been devoted to how can I become a better critical thinker? How can I think through the information that comes across my screen and my desk? And so education is a solution, but we have to be mindful that the educated are very subject to propaganda campaigns, and I include myself there. I'm never above it. And I see far too many of us out there who think that we have risen above this through all of the knowledge that we have. But in fact, a lot of our circulation of information is quite poor and clotted and such. But my other point I wanted to say is that with China, this is so interesting with this notion of having the domestic economy and will it delink from the world. The Chinese students who go around the world, this is something that I really wonder, will China pull back on that? Because I've got a number of Chinese students in my Japanese university classes, and of course they are now in China. But Japan has 80,000 or more Chinese students at some of the best universities. We don't see that same proportion of Japanese students going to China. We know Chinese students go all over the world to study. So they become information carriers and image carriers for China, and also part of this global outreach that is so strong now in China, of this yearning for respectability in the international sphere.
I apologize, we will be cut off. Thank you so much, both of you. I invite audience to come to other panels and engage.
Thank you. Thank you. Great.
Thank you. Thank you for comments.